of modernity, of productivity, of wealth.
By the late 20s, 43% of the world's goods were produced in America, as manufacturers of all kinds tried to emulate Henry Ford's assembly line technology.
If you can make something as complicated as an automobile on an assembly line, the reasoning goes that I ought to be able to make toasters and phonographs and other things which should be much simpler.
They look good, don't they? They taste good, too.
Ford's method of mass production, however, required mass consumption in order to maximize profit and minimize cost. That simple formula would ultimately prove to be the undoing of some early manufacturers. But that didn't stop any of them from applying the new assembly line technology.
There are new products coming on into the home, electrical appliances, which had been sort of experimented with at the turn of the century, but these were going in wholesale into American homes. You have companies like General Electric, Westinghouse that are beginning to make home appliances with moving line assembly.
The assembly line allowed not only more stuff to be made, but more complicated stuff, higher quality stuff, things like radios and phonographs, things that had once been fairly high-end, kind of abundance, a kind of material abundance that simply people had never experienced before.
By 1927, the American factory worker had a third more purchasing power than a decade before. Newly created installment plans allowed consumers to snap up refrigerators, washing machines, automobiles, and other goods as fast as they were coming off the assembly lines, with one exception.
Foster Gunnison liked to see himself as the Henry Ford of housing. He built a factory that built houses, very simple houses with simple wall structures on a moving line basis. A lot of things that actually went into custom-built homes had actually been mass-produced, things like fixtures, things like bathtubs, etc., that those were already mass-produced.
A study conducted at that time concluded that for some reason, with regard to housing, Americans, quote, refused to allow their tastes to succumb to mass production techniques and its concomitant standardization, unquote.
Consumers, for the most part, have rejected mass-produced houses.
In other words, Foster Gunnison was out of the assembly line housing business. While American consumers rejected homes built on the assembly line, they wholeheartedly embraced automobiles mass-produced in this way.
We talk about car companies so much in this assembly line context because really that's where the assembly line was perfected and grew up, and it's where it matured.
Ford's original assembly line was designed not so much to build cars as to build the Model T. But the Model T offered precious little choice to consumers and only came in one color, black. Sure, it was cheap, but now consumers wanted variety, and General Motors geared up to give it to them.
One of the things that General Motors realized was nobody was going to compete with Henry Ford directly on price. So the key was to make a car that cost a little more than a Ford, but offered more than a Ford. And that's really where they tried to target the Chevrolet.
What you see in the assembly line, in terms of engineering the assembly line, is essentially working out methods by which you can have greater variety.
By 1926, Ford had lost 25% of the market share to General Motors, which was now offering the more expensive Chevrolet in a number of colors, with a variety of options. In 1927, Ford reluctantly abandoned the reliable Model T and introduced a new model.
It was an enormous, wrenching change to shut down his factories, retool them to produce the next car, which he called the Model A, and was a very different, much more modern automobile than the Model T. It was a colossal change for them. Not only was it expensive, but there was also a tremendous personnel cost. And they threw a lot of people out, they fired a lot of people, brought in different people.
When they begin to assemble the Model A, they have tremendous problems. making the assembly line work.
The switch over to the Model A cost Ford more than $250 million. Having produced the Model T for 19 years, the Model A required massive retooling for its 5,580 parts, almost all of which were new. It was a painfully unprofitable lesson in tracking consumer demand.
General Motors was able to make those kinds of changes much more easily because they had never pursued things as far down that cul-de-sac as Ford Motor Company had.
Unlike Ford with its monumental manufacturing plants, General Motors was able to make a variety of cars because they had several smaller facilities, with assembly lines dedicated to different models. The annual model change, which was introduced by General Motors, soon became a rite of passage for American motorists, and consumers had their wish for variety and style. After more than a decade, manufacturers had learned how to dedicate their assembly lines to changing consumer demands. And by 1941, during World War II, there was no bigger, more demanding consumer than the United States government.
I think Lewis Mumford said that really there's no kind of demand like demand that comes about through warfare, because first of all, you need a lot of things and you destroy a lot of things. Creates this tremendous demand.
Here is the arsenal of democracy at work. One plant among thousands dotted across the vast United States.
Detroit's automotive assembly lines transformed themselves.
Effectively, what you're doing is creating something entirely different. I mean, that process of conversion over to wartime industry is one where the whole shop floor is just literally in turmoil.
An industry which had been geared to produce the 32 million cars currently in use by civilians, refocused, retooled, and renewed its commitment to unleash the inexhaustible power of the wartime assembly line.
Plants that build tanks like these, huge lumbering juggernauts, in numbers that stagger the imagination.
If you look at the history of the war, you'll see that the United States created a tremendous amount of war material.
World War II also sees the coming in of large numbers of women and large numbers of African Americans. Prior to that time, it was believed that neither women nor African Americans had the skills to work the machinery and the heavy equipment that was tied to the industry. There's a lot of contention in the auto industry through the war years. As African American workers are upgraded to the machines and the assembly lines, there are sometimes what are referred to as hate strikes. White workers who would go on strike because they didn't want to see the upgrading of African American workers. And the same thing occurred with women workers sometimes.
In spite of an openly hostile environment, the capabilities of blacks and women were clearly demonstrated by their output.
This is mass production, as only American engineers know how.
By the end of the war in 1945, they had produced 90,000 bombers, 57,000 aircraft engines, 250,000 tanks and jeeps.
One of the major reasons that we won World War II was because we were able to produce all kinds of war material, from tanks and airplanes to clothing and helmets, at a faster rate, at a cheaper price than any other nation on earth. So we were able to build ships faster than the Japanese and the Germans combined could sink them.
Next, post-war Japan reconstructs the assembly line. During World War II, women and black assembly line workers earned only 60% of the white male wage.